It was just another Saturday night in Brooklyn when Sarah Carter's life took a sinister turn. She was an artist, working a late shift at her small gallery downtown. But that evening, a call came that would shake her to her core. Her grandmother, Elizabeth, had passed away suddenly in her apartment. Sarah had always felt a deep connection to her grandmother, who had raised her after her parents' untimely deaths. There had been something almost otherworldly about her, like she knew things no one else did. But what Sarah didn't realize was that her grandmother's apartment, apartment 7A, was more than just an old living space in the heart of Brooklyn. It held secrets, dark, disturbing secrets that had been buried for decades, and now they were clawing their way back to the surface. After her grandmother's funeral, Sarah found herself standing in front of the old brownstone where Elizabeth had lived for the last 40 years. The apartment building was located in the once posh, now crumbling neighborhood of Greenpoint, a place steeped in history and shadows. Despite the faded exterior, apartment 7A had always felt like a sanctuary to Sarah. It was where she had spent her childhood after her parents died in a tragic car accident. Elizabeth's apartment had been filled with warmth, stories of their Polish ancestry, and a sense of calm that shielded Sarah from the harshness of the world outside. But that sense of safety had evaporated. As Sarah walked through the dusty rooms, now eerily silent without her grandmother's presence, she began to notice things that felt off. The apartment seemed colder than usual. Objects weren't where they were supposed to be. The atmosphere was thick with a tension that set her on edge. There was one particular thing that haunted her more than the rest. A series of old photographs she found in a small locked drawer in her grandmother's study. They were black and white, worn at the edges, depicting a young Elizabeth, but not the cheerful woman Sarah remembered. In these photos, Elizabeth looked scared, as though someone or something was watching her. And in the background, always faint but visible, was the shape of a shadowy figure. As Sarah studied the photos, she felt a strange sensation of being watched, as if the figure from the past was still lingering in the apartment. Sarah's unease grew when she bumped into Mrs. Kowalski, an elderly neighbor who had lived in the building for as long as she could remember. Mrs. Kowalski was known for being nosy and eccentric, but she had always adored Elizabeth. Now, as she saw Sarah moving through the hallways of the building, her normally chatty demeanor became somber. "You should be careful in there," Mrs. Kowalski said in a hushed tone, glancing nervously at apartment 7A. That apartment, your grandmother, she knew things. She was connected to the others who lived there before. Strange things happened in that apartment, Sarah. Bad things. Sarah dismissed it as the ramblings of an old woman, but something about the way Mrs. Kowalski's eyes darkened when she spoke left a lasting impression. As Sarah turned to leave, Mrs. Kowalski grabbed her arm, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've heard the stories, haven't you? About the others who lived there before your grandmother?" Sarah shook her head, her heart pounding. She had never heard anything about previous tenants. But before she could press further, Mrs. Kowalski disappeared into her own apartment, leaving Sarah with a sinking feeling that the apartment's history was far more sinister than she had realized. Over the following days, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Driven by a growing sense of dread and curiosity, she began researching the history of the building, specifically apartment 7A. What she uncovered was chilling. The apartment had a long history of tragedies. In 1947, a young couple had moved in shortly after their wedding, only to vanish without a trace 6 months later. Their disappearance had never been solved. In 1962, a widowed professor took up residence, and within a year, he was found dead under mysterious circumstances. His body had been discovered in a grotesque position, as though he had been trying to escape something unseen. There were more stories too. Stories of people hearing whispers in the walls, seeing shadowy figures move in the corners of their vision, and waking up to find their belongings mysteriously rearranged. The deeper Sarah dug, the more she felt her grandmother's death might not have been as natural as it seemed. As the days wore on, Sarah began experiencing strange occurrences in the apartment. At night, she would hear faint footsteps in the hallway, despite being alone. The whispers Mrs. Kowalski had mentioned seemed to echo through the walls, just barely audible, but unmistakable. And then, there were the shadows, dark, fleeting shapes that seemed to follow her, always lurking just out of sight. One night, Sarah woke up to find herself standing in front of her grandmother's old bedroom mirror, her reflection distorted. She couldn't remember how she had gotten there, and a deep sense of unease settled over her. She began to suspect that whatever was haunting the apartment had latched onto her, just as it had done to the tenants before her. But the question remained, what did it want? Desperate for answers, Sarah returned to the old photos she had found in her grandmother's study. There was something about them, a pattern she hadn't noticed before. In each photo, Elizabeth was standing near the same piece of furniture, a small, intricately carved wooden chest that Sarah remembered vaguely from her childhood. The chest had always been locked, and Elizabeth had never let anyone touch it. Now, Sarah was determined to find out what was inside. She located the chest in a dusty corner of the study, half hidden under a pile of old quilts. The lock was rusted, but with some effort, Sarah managed to pry it open. Inside, she found a collection of old yellowing papers, letters written in Polish, cryptic journal entries, and sketches of strange symbols that made Sarah's skin crawl. Among the papers was a small leather-bound notebook. As she flipped through the pages, she realized that this wasn't just a diary. It was a record of something far darker. The notebook detailed a ritual, an ancient rite that had been passed down through generations of her family. The purpose of the ritual was unclear, but the notebook warned of dire consequences if it was not performed correctly. The last entry, dated just weeks before Elizabeth's death, was chilling. It has returned. I can feel it watching. I must complete the ritual, or it will take her, just like the others. The weight of the discovery bore down on Sarah. Her grandmother had known that something dark was haunting the apartment, and she had been trying to protect her. But now, it seemed, the darkness had latched on to Sarah. That night, Sarah awoke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. This time, they were louder, closer. She got out of bed, her heart pounding, and crept toward the door. The apartment was pitch black, but she could sense a presence in the room with her. As she reached for the light switch, a cold gust of air swept past her, and she froze. There, in the corner of the room, was a shadowy figure, tall, looming, its features obscured by darkness. The figure moved closer, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't human. It was something ancient, something that had been waiting for her. Panic surged through her, and Sarah fled the apartment, the sound of footsteps following her all the way down the stairs and out onto the street. After that night, Sarah couldn't bear to return to the apartment. She stayed with a friend and spent her days at the local library, poring over historical records and trying to make sense of what she had experienced. It was there that she found the missing piece of the puzzle. An old newspaper article from the 1930s detailed a series of unexplained deaths in the very building where Elizabeth had lived. The article mentioned that the building had been constructed over the site of an old asylum that had burned down in 1901. The asylum had been notorious for its mistreatment of patients, and many had died under mysterious circumstances. The article ended with a disturbing note. Locals believe the spirits of the asylum's lost souls still linger in the area, unable to move on. Residents of the new building have reported strange occurrences, but authorities have yet to investigate. Armed with the knowledge of the building's dark history and the ritual her grandmother had tried to complete, Sarah knew what she had to do. She returned to apartment 7A1 last time, determined to finish what her grandmother had started and rid the apartment of whatever malevolent force had been haunting it for decades. With the notebook in hand, Sarah set up the ritual, following the instructions carefully. The air in the apartment felt thick, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were closing in on her. As she lit the candles and recited the words, the shadows began to move, swirling around her like a storm. And then, suddenly, the room fell silent. The shadows dissipated, and the cold, heavy presence that had haunted the apartment was gone. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a sense of peace. Months later, Sarah sold the apartment and moved out of Brooklyn. She never told anyone what had happened in apartment 7A, nor did she keep any of her grandmother's old belongings. But sometimes, late at night, she would dream of the apartment, the dark hallways, the shadowy figures, the whispers in the walls. And in those dreams, she always heard the same voice. "It's not over."